The oldest part of the church started in the 12th century, and we have, as you come into the church, around the south doorway, we have Norman chevron carving, which illustrates the age of the church. The church originally was just a rectangular box with a flat roof, so quite dark inside. And then the tower was added around about the 13th, 14th century. The chancel was added in the 15th century. And then the north aisle and, vestry and what is now a kitchen area, the work there started in 1895. And we still have the trowel that was used to lay the foundation stone. And we have an account somewhere of the day's events. And apparently it absolutely poured with rain all day. The interior of the church, when the north aisle was added and the present arches were constructed, prior to that wall, the north wall, was just a plain wall with no windows, so it had been quite dark inside. The bells themselves, the current bells, were actually hung in 1845 by a company of bell founders called John Taylor and Sons in Loughborough. In the latter half of the 19th century, Killamarsh treble bob was actually composed here by one of our bell ringers at the time called Charles Severn. And treble bob is a method of change ringing, and there are many, many different varieties of it. Killamarsh treble bob being just one. Churchyard, outside the church we do have a Saxon preaching cross which predates the church and shows that there's been a centre of Christianity on this site for longer than the church has been here. It may, the current church may have replaced an earlier wooden one, but so some history books tell us. In the churchyard, as well as the Saxon cross, we have the parish stocks, the village stocks. And we've often wondered why we've got the stocks in the churchyard. And we found out a few years ago, we were told that in the Middle Ages, the Lord of the Manor would have held court in the church, hearing grievances, and if anybody was found guilty of a grievance, where did they go? In the stocks. So that's why the stocks are here rather than elsewhere in the village. I particularly like the stained glass windows, and in particular we have one from the 15th century depicting Mary, the mother of Jesus, with the infant Jesus. Sancta Maria is its title, and it shows the infant Jesus. It's rather unusual, so it shows the infant Jesus with the head, hands and feet of an old man, which was often the way he was depicted in the Middle Ages because it showed wisdom and old age. They couldn't appreciate that a baby, just born, had been around since before creation, Jesus, the Son of God, God the creator of the universe, and so that's why they depicted him with the head, hands and feet of an old man as a symbol of wisdom and old age. Another window I particularly like is the east window, and there are two unusual parts of that as well. If you look very carefully in the left-hand light, there is a blue shield. In that shield is Judas Iscariot with his purse and the rope that he hanged himself with round his neck, and around his head there's a crescent shape, and that's the 30 pieces of silver that he was paid to betray Jesus. And if you look in the right-hand light, there's a similar shield, and there are two lanterns in there, and a sword. And if you look very carefully on the sword, there's something rather gruesome. It's an ear, and that goes back to the arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Peter drew his sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. And we've been told that it's very unusual to have that kind of depiction in any stained glass window. And then at the back of the nave, near the font, is a memorial window to all those who lost their lives in 2 world wars, and it was the only war memorial in Killamarsh until a new memorial was erected about 15 years ago. The font itself is Norman, so dates back to when the church was first built. But in the about 1850, Killamarsh became a parish in its own right, and so had our first rector in Killamarsh. Prior to that, it was what was known as a chapel of ease from the parish of Eckington. The new rector apparently can't have liked the old Norman font and had a new font erected in the church, Victorian font, and the Norman font was taken out. At the beginning of the 20th century, the then incumbent here in Killamarsh, Reverend Francis Metcalfe, he found the original font being used by a cobbler up Ashley Lane to soak his leather in. And he bought the font back for the grand sum of £1.10, but that in 1900 that would have been a fair amount of money. And the Norman font was erected in the churchyard. Then in 1944, the Norman font was reinstated inside the church, and the Victorian font was put into storage. And then in 2018, when the church was being refurbished, we applied to have the Victorian font taken out of the church, and eventually had agreement for it to be erected outside near the memorial window. So that's why, as people are coming down towards the church, they'll see a font outside.